Hello, and welcome everybody to According to Andrew number 92, Review of Historical Dynamics, Why States Fall by Peter Turchin. So this is kind of the last book that I have of his, so I decided to read all three of the books that I picked up by him right in a row. In hindsight, I should have read this one first because it does the best job of covering everything. But before we get into that, I want to make an announcement, which is that I am on Spotify and some of the other streaming platforms. I'm still working on getting on Apple, but if those are your preferred streaming platform or podcast platforms over Podbean, those are now available to you. So go to where you are, see if you can find it. It's either going to be under According to Andrew or Up Chuck Duck, because I'm terrible at branding. So that's a short announcement right there, and I'll tell you guys again at the end. But anyway, into the book. So this is an excellent book, and it's shorter than the other ones. It's about 200 pages. This one focuses more on a lot of the different. So the previous two books focused on one specific thing. So his secular cycle is focused on the secular cycle analysis, and then a lot of different case studies and how they can get applied. Ages of Discord looked at structural demographic theory and how that applied to the modern United States as its case study. And in those ones, the advantage is he went much more specific into the math. He went much more specific into a lot of the indicators and what's the term? The indicators and the data sets that he pulled from to get his analysis, his review of the material. He doesn't do that in this one because this is kind of a setup. This book was written first, and so this is a setup book for these other books, which is like, hey, here's kind of the general theory. This is what we got to go with. Here's some kind of math that we can base this on, but we need to find ways that we can take uh, these these equations and quantify them, pull the data sets, and apply them. And there is some of that in this book, but it's not nearly to the level of the other two books. But those focused on a very specific theory, structural demographic, or secular cycle, and this one covers the greater breadth of them. So that I really appreciated, and I probably should have read it. If you're just trying to understand what these different kind of dynamics within historical dynamics are, this is the book to read because it's going to cover all of them. And then if you're maybe interested in the more specifics, then I recommend going to Ages of Discord or Secular Cycles, depending. Because the thing is, the two uh, ideas that I was most interested in, I don't believe he has a book on yet, and I don't know if he's planning on doing it, but we'll get to there. So, well, I guess the two are the frontier theory and um, ethnokinetics. But we'll get to that. So, it's split into 9 chapters, 10 chapters. So there's an introduction, which just goes into why we need all this stuff. Then geopolitics is the first kind of theory that he dives into a little bit. Each chapter is about 30-ish pages. Uh, Collective solidarity, where he goes into this idea of Abyssian, and basically he uses that term a lot throughout the book. That is one criticism I probably have of the book, is he kind of has these terms that he uses throughout the book, but then he doesn't have a um, like definition area to kind of be like, oh, this is what these mean. So if you're like not in that chapter and you're like trying to, and you came back like a couple days later and you're like, what is the definition of this? You got to like flip back to the previous chapter to figure it out. So that part kind of was annoying, but once you got kind of used to some of the terminology, it wasn't nearly as bad. Abyssian basically just means it's based on the theory of a guy, a Muslim scholar back in like the 1500s, I believe, named Abyssian that he talks about in here. And it's basically cohesiveness within a society. It's more than that, but that's effectively what it boils down to. So you have collective solidarity, uh, meta-ethnic frontier theory is the next thing he dives into, and that basically touches on what how the frontiers interact with each other, because at the borders you're going to have these kind of weird spots where the French and German border meet, or the Spanish and French border, the French and Italian border. I don't know why I'm using France for this example, but and so you're going to have you're going to have more interaction with those groups on the frontier. The more extreme example of that back in those days was your steppe people and the people that were in the more wooded area where the steppe people couldn't really break into, and kind of the interaction there of getting pushing into the steppe a little bit, getting pushed back out, and he has a he has 2 case studies in here, so it's much more limited that he goes through, and Russia is the example that he uses for that case study where that works out that way. An empirical test for the meta-ethnic, so he kind of does a quasi-test study here and kind of looks at whether or not this makes sense. Ethnokinetics, basically it's the study of the rate at which cultural assimilation can happen and cultural change happens, and whether or not that cultural change is going to cause divisions, because there's not a very strong people that are coming into the empire are staying their original ethnicity and not switching to the current ethnicity, the reigning ethnicity, which is a current problem in the United States, but there's a host of other issues and other things that get into that. So you have that issue, and then the main defining lines he uses for this is the major religions. Your Islam, your Christianity, and your Mormon, how they were spread and how they were kind of enforced and spread throughout the society and culture and stuff like that. Obviously, Mormonism isn't to nearly the extent that Islam and Christianity is, though technically Mormonism is a sect of Christianity. Then we get into demographic structural theory, same stuff that's in the demographic structural book of Ages of Discord. Basically covers a lot of the same stuff. There's maybe a little bit of new stuff in here, but a lot of that stuff got transferred into that other book, so I'm not going to cover that too much here. Then you have secular cycles. Again, a lot of the same stuff that's covered in his secular cycles book. So if you've already read that, great. If you've already listened to my video on that, I'm not going to repeat that here. I'll link both those videos in the corner thing for people who are interested in it. Then he goes into a case study and he goes through each of these different cycles where he kind of, because the thing is with these is your meta-ethnic frontier, like there's aspects of it that it's like some of these are better applied to the decline and some of these are better applied to the rise. So your demographic structural theory, yeah, it does cover the rise and the fall and stuff like that, but it's better at understanding why things collapse. Same with your secular cycles. It's better at understanding why things collapse, where your meta-ethnic frontier theory is better at understanding how things coalesce and start the rising action of a society and a polity. And that was something that I'd been wanting an answer to forever, and I couldn't find it. So there's Vox talks about ethnicity and stuff like that, and I always kind of had those questions about, well, what about the frontiers? How do they interact? What causes, like, why on this it's not arbitrary border, but like on the border of France and Germany, like, why are people on one side of the line, why are they French, and why are the people on the other side of the line German, and why do they identify with one or the other? And in all honesty, they don't necessarily identify. It turns out, as you kind of dig into this stuff, that it's a lot blurrier than it seems. There's pockets within France where it's like they didn't even speak the French language. They had their own like unique language within France that they spoke till like 1860 or something ridiculous. And I still think there's pockets within France where that's the case. So all that stuff's kind of crazy when you think about it. When you're, at least as an American, that's something that seems kind of weird to me. But that's kind of the nature of how a lot of these ethnic dynamics developed over time. But I think it gives the best understanding, the best rationale for understanding how these dynamics worked and how why this group identifies as this versus this group identifying as this, and how that can change over time as the central authorities in these various regions weaken and have their highs and lows. So it'll be, I think that's the meta-ethnic and the meta-ethnic frontier theory and the ethnokinetics, I think, are the best for understanding our future and where things are going. Basically, to give a summary of what the meta-ethnic frontier theory is people on the frontier have to remain, basically the people in the center in the cities, they get soft, and the people on the frontier have to remain hard and determined, but they also have interactions with all these other cultures more than the people in the center. And so that causes them to culturally change over time, and eventually that causes such a schism with the people in the center versus the people on the frontier, that the people of the frontier effectively become their own ethnicity, their own nation, and then they take that frontier and they conquer the center, and then they become the ruling ethnicity and the ruling nation within the nation state. And that's generally the idea. And so he had good examples of how this kind of happens over time with France, and how you had the Carolingian Empire that fell, and then you had the Burgundians were vying with the who was it? The is it the Avantgardes? Something like that. Uh, and I think some other group. And so then there was that battle for who was going to be, and they were and like basically because they were warring constantly, they were constantly at the frontier. A lot of the reason that you had such a growing in the European area was because basically everybody was on a frontier, and there was, especially after the collapse of the Roman Empire, there's constant vying and repositioning and fighting until we're in our current state. But there's a lot of places that lasted for 300-400 years that all of a sudden started to collapse. When you look at like France and stuff like that, there's a lot of nations that you wouldn't even recognize or even think of today that lasted for longer than the United States has lasted, and so and you don't even think about them anymore. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking, oh, there's no way the United States could collapse, or it's going to be going to need to be some major event, like these other nations lived for a while and then they stopped existing because of a lot of different factors. So it's something to keep in mind. But it's definitely, if you're trying to understand that aspect of why nations rise, fall, how a nation gets formed, this is a good book to read for sure. It covers all that stuff in the point. Oh, it's also, I like how it's written because it's at the end of each chapter. In the conclusion, it's just a series of bullet points that goes through each of the things that's covered in the chapter. So if you are like, I don't know if I want to, like, if you're someone who's like really diving and trying to read this book for very specific information, you can flip to the end of the chapter, read the summary, read all the bullet points, be like, oh, okay, I want to know about this, this, and this from this chapter, and so then you can start reading the entire chapter. Or you can be like, oh, this doesn't cover information that I care about, move on to the next chapter. And so you can buzz through this really quickly if you're skimming it for very specific data, which is really nice. That's a great way of writing it for the research-minded person. One thing that I was able to glean from this and kind of pull from this book was kind of why the United States tolerates lower casualty rates, because that's something that I've kind of been bouncing around in my head and I've talked about on previous podcasts. And so, one of that possible things that kind of came up through this book was the ethnic fragmentation that exists in America, and on top of its geographic location. So America is already isolated, so there's not really a reason to politically vie and fight for a lot of the stuff that we don't need to go to Europe to fight things. Whereas like in France during World War I, World War II, like Germany was coming into their country, right? Like you don't really have a choice but to fight. America doesn't really have that problem. Obviously, we have immigration issues, and immigration is just the opposite side of, or is the same coin. What is that phrase? Immigration and war are interchangeable, basically, and that's from Martin Van Greville. But anyway, so because of this, these different ethnicities that exist inside of America, they're willing to die for the cause as a much lower percentage. So basically, what he was talking about with the Abyssinian and how groups form is there's basically a certain percentage of the population that is willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater of the group. So he talked about how people act like everyone's individuals, but the basic interactions with how groups work means that they can't be, because people sacrifice a lot for the sake of the group. And one of the biggest ones is sacrificing your own life for the sake of the group. And that just, on a pure cost-benefit analysis for the individual, that doesn't make any actual sense. So he kind of goes into the idea that these higher ideals are held by a certain percentage of the group, and the more cohesive and the more identity and solidarity that the group has with each other, the more people are going to be willing, and the greater percentage of people that are going to be willing to risk their lives to keep and protect that national identity. This is kind of different in America because that passionate percentage is going to be lower because the amount of people that are identified as American and what the definition of American is has been watered down so much, especially over the years. And so these people with these different ethnic backgrounds and the willingness to sacrifice for this new ethnic group is usually an ethnic group that is usually an economic arrangement more than one forged by a bond of blood and tradition, makes the willingness to fight and die much lower than in nations with people that are ethnically of that nation, and is not an empire as the U.S. is. One way to measure, one way to possibly measure this passionate rate could be the percentage of the population that sign up when a new war is initiated, but before a draft is instituted, or the percentage of soldiers lost as a percentage of the population before war weariness kicks in, or just the percentage that are willing to die. So a good proxy for this that I always try to think of is like why so many people were willing to die, especially for like Soviet Russia. Like, sure, it's like a totalitarian regime and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, like people could have overthrown it. Like it's totalitarianism doesn't get like there had to have been some net benefit because totalitarianism doesn't just you can't you can lead a horse to water but you can't force it to drink, and tyranny only lasts so long. It doesn't usually last the 80 years that it does. And the fact that Russia was willing to sacrifice 20% of its population, and part of it was a fight for survival, right? Germans were on their soil. That's a personal beef kind of thing. Much more people are going to be willing to die for that. So that's an aspect of it. But at the same time, it seems like the rate at which Russia was willing to take casualties seems wildly out of proportion for what seems like something that people shouldn't have that great of loyalty to. But obviously, the loyalty wasn't to the state, which is where a lot of people get things confused, but between brothers and between other nationality, the other people in your nation, the other Russians and such. But I find that one particularly interesting because the way the state's taking care of people really isn't sufficient, but yet the national identity between people is strong enough that they are willing to not really care about the state situation and fight very passionately to save their nation. So, and then I talked about how those. Oh, one interesting thing about the meta-ethnic frontier and how he covers most of this book is he kind of assumes like there is really no such thing as a nation state in his definition. And to a certain extent, it makes sense why that's not the case because basically you have forming nation expands to its farthest possible reaches, becomes an empire, the empire collapses, and that's generally how everything's worked. Very few countries or nations have kept themselves in check and been like, these are all the people that are, Carolingian. I don't know why I'm going to use that one, but Carolingian, and we're not going to expand outside of these borders because this is where Carolingian is, and this is everyone who's here is Carolingian. No one else is in. Like the only people that act like that are the Japanese and the Chinese. Maybe some other East Asian, but like it's a very Eastern way of thinking, where the expansionary way is a very Western way of thinking. And even then, like you can see a lot of the cycles within China, and there's plenty of China is such a large area that it's still fairly multi-ethnic, even though it is like 95% Han Chinese right now. But anyway, it's interesting how that it would be interesting to see how if people decided not to continually expand and incorporate ethnic groups outside that they can't assimilate into their own culture, what effect that would have on the overall cyclic nature of the cycle. So again, this is a great explanation on how nations were formed, where other books have focused on how they fall. Since they are already in collapse, I see it as more useful to look towards the future and understanding how nations are formed because we are currently at the stage where a lot of that nation forming is going to happen, and the indicators that it takes for how those strong nations are formed so that we can get a proper blueprint and prevent future conflicts and prevent future issues. If you can get the foundation correct, your chances of surviving into the future are great. Now, no one's perfect, and there's definitely going to be a lot of issues, but the better starting structure you can have, the better. It's kind of a good indicator on how messy the upcoming conflict in America is going to be, because if you look at the meta-ethnic frontier theory, like where are the frontiers in America? They're everywhere, right? Where's the fault line between this group and that group? It's like so blurry and so messy that we got stuff running between cities, like the it's to the point where it's basically neighborhoods kinda, and even a lot of the neighborhoods are starting to get mixed and stuff like that. And so when conflict breaks out, it's going to be an issue where you know I, how much can you trust your neighbor kind of thing is what it might come down to. uh, and so it's gonna be really messy where people are kind of rushed and have to figure out where their tribe is all of a sudden, and there's going to be a lot of ethnic conflict there. And then as that gets figured out, it's going to force a lot of people to start moving. That moving is going to cause other issues because you're going to bump into other ethnicities and stuff like that. That's going to cause that immigration and migration is going to cause conflict because it always does. And so that's where I see this upcoming potential conflict. Well, not potential, upcoming conflict in America. Why it's going to be such a mess. Why it's going to be so bloody because the lines of where groups are on the map is so blurry and so mixed that it's going to be an absolute mess. So sorry to kind of end on a dour note, but Historical Dynamics, excellent book. If you want to understand upcoming, what potential upcoming historical trends that we're going to be seeing, and understanding how nations are formed and all that stuff, which is another thing that we're going to be seeing in the coming decades. Definitely recommend reading this book. It's a great one. If you're interested in Ages of Discord or Secular Cycles, I recommend reading this one first, as it will give you a primer for those and allow you to skip over those things. If you are just specifically interested in those dynamic models, then by all means grab those books first. But I think this is a good primer to get you to understand those. And then if you want to deep dive more into those specifics and better case studies, I recommend those other two books. So that basically wraps it up here. Like I said, I'm on YouTube and BitChute, and then I'm also on Podbean and all at Spotify, and basically where all podcasts are available outside of like your not YouTube, Apple. I'm working on it, but I basically need a approval process needs to go through. But anyway, that's where I'm at. Like and share, subscribe, all that good stuff. Thank you guys for listening, and have yourselves a good day. Goodbye.